Well, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Sophie Scompson. I'm here with Dr. Richard Dennis, who is the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, as you can see in the background there. And the Oz Institute is a public policy think tank that does a lot of research around economic, social and environmental issues. And very pleased to have you with us here tonight, Richard, for your all the intel on the government's budget and the opposition's reply. And what I would say is it's really good being on the crossbench in situations like this because we get to comment and compare and contrast both the government's budget and also the opposition's reply. So we'll do a bit of that tonight. And I think we'll just kick straight into it. But the government's budget, this is the second surplus in as many years, and they've managed to deliver tax cuts for every employee or person that's employed or working in the country. And there's a $300 cost of living relief for every household. But I would say that spending is probably at the highest levels I've heard since 1986. So there's always a really fine path to tread between relieving that pressure on cost of living, but not pushing up inflation too much. So what do you think? Do you think that they've managed to avoid poking that inflation bear?
Oh, I think so. I think you've captured the big things quite well there, Sophie. I mean, the stage 3 tax cuts are, really the biggest income tax cuts in modern times, costing around $20 billion a year. Yes, the Labor government reformed those stage 3 tax cuts. Previously, people earning below $45,000 literally wouldn't have got anything. So that would have been particularly hard for people working part-time, most often women, young people working part-time, most often students. So the previous version of the tax cuts wouldn't have given anything to a lot of young people, literally wouldn't have given anything to a lot of women, whereas the stage 3 tax cuts that did pass still deliver quite significant tax cuts for high income earners, around $4,500 a year for people earning over $200,000 a year. So really quite big tax cuts for those earning quite a lot of money, but shifted compared to the Liberals' policy, quite a lot of money down towards the bottom. Now, that's certainly good for reducing inequality, certainly good for helping low-income earners and second earners in a family where you've got a full-time worker and a part-time worker. And I think that's been quite a beneficial thing. That was announced early in the year. The big budget announcement was the $300 energy rebate. And look, some people are saying that's not much. Some people are saying that's way too much. Some people are saying it should have been targeted. Some people are saying it's great that it wasn't targeted. That's democracy. But from an economist's point of view, I think it's a clever way to help people reduce cost of living pressures without causing the inflation that you referred to. So, there's always a tightrope, but to be honest, I'm more worried about the economy slipping into recession than I am in, inflation being about to surge.
Well, let's talk about recession a little bit later on, but those the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts were a little bit controversial. So we did a survey here in Mackellar to find out what people actually thought about it. And the majority of people were supportive of the changes to make it fairer. So I supported those to come through. And I think it did make it fairer. With the cost of living pressures that people are under at the moment, I think people understood that we needed to have a fairer distribution of those tax cuts. The big question that, everyone asks following a budget, particularly in this environment of, cost of living pressures, do you think that there will be an interest rate cut before Christmas this year?
Look, thanks for asking. You know what it's like. So if you're a doctor, you go to parties, everyone kind of says, look, I got this weird spot on my skin. Well, when you're an economist, wherever you go, people say, what's going to happen with interest rates? And trust me, doctors are better at diagnosing spots than economists are at predicting interest rates. Literally no one knows. Because, for example, one of the reasons that we had high interest rates was that after COVID, there were all sorts of supply bottlenecks. And then there's the war in Ukraine. So no economist knows if there's going to be a war in the Middle East, another war in the Middle East. No economist knows if there's going to be some big supply shock somewhere in Asia. So literally no one knows. But economists, our trick, the way we get around that is we say, well, all other things being equal, which is kind of a cop-out, where we say, now imagine nothing unexpected happens. So if we imagine nothing unexpected happens, the trajectory we're on, I think it's quite likely that we'll see interest rates cut towards the end of the year, probably November or December. Why do I think that? Well, because inflation has actually been falling quite steadily. Some people wish it would fall faster, but the reality is the 2 to 3% inflation target range that the RBA is always worried about, well, we're tracking steadily towards that. If we were plane, it looks like we're coming into land right where the runway is. So you might want to hurry up and land, but it's actually nicer to be on course. But while inflation's coming down, parts of the economy are really starting to soften, in part because the Reserve Bank increased interest rates so high. So retail spending at the moment is actually really falling in ways that make me a bit concerned. And ultimately, the Reserve Bank, while it's actively been trying to slow the economy down, the RBA doesn't actually want to cause a recession. So I think if we stay on the path we're on, inflation will keep falling, that retail sales will continue to soften. Now, that's bad news for small business, that's bad news for people who work in retail, but if consumer demand continues to soften, I think that makes it far more likely the Reserve Bank will cut rates. And again, that's the path we're on at the moment.
And I guess that also feeds into another question that people can't really answer unless you're the Prime Minister, and that's if there is a tax, if there is an interest rate reduction or cut, when does what does that mean for the next election as well? That's another question that follows quickly on from it. I think we'll pick up about retail and spending and your concerns about a recession a little bit later on. We'll talk about small business, but just want to continue on the cost of living at the moment. And as the Treasurer says, people are really under the pump in Australia at the moment. People all over the country are under the pump. And for the government this year, trying to address that cost of living pressure was their number one priority. And we saw that. We've talked about the tax cuts for all. We've talked about the $300 energy bill rebate that people will get, that households will get. A few other good things were the superannuation, the new superannuation that will be paid on top of government-funded paid parental leave. I think that was a good move. And the 10% rent assistance increase, and then lastly the indexation of HECS so that it's fairer for students who have a HECS debt. There's a lot of things in there. You'll probably mention some others as well, but do you think all these cost of living measures will actually have make a palpable difference to people? Are they going to feel it in their hip pockets, or are they going to continue to be under the pressure and this really goes by without being noticed?
Oh, look, somewhere in the middle of that, I think. There's no doubt that for someone who's struggling to pay the rent, a small increase in rent assistance is actually really useful. Is it enough? Is it enough to make them feel like they are where they might have been a year or two ago? Probably not. So I think when we look at what the government did, it's had a wide range of these so-called cost of living measures you described, HECS, housing, electricity. And while there's a wide range of supports, which means that most Australians will get some support, there's not a lot of support for anyone. So, now that said, if the government had have thrown a lot of money to help particular groups, they probably would have come under more pressure and more criticism for saying, oh, that's going to cause inflation, or that's unfair. Why'd you pick that group more than this group? So I can understand why the government's gone about things in the way they have, but in spreading it around with, everybody got the energy rebate, everyone getting rent assistance got a small increase in rent assistance, but most people don't get rent assistance, so these are good measures, these are necessary measures. And when you combine them with the stage 3 tax cuts, which people will really notice, like when from July 1, that's when people will literally see their pay packets go up. The budget's now, but the tax cuts don't kick in until July 1. I think those things will be noticed by people. I think they will help people. But there'll certainly be a lot of people saying, well, I need more help than that.
And I guess one of the areas that I know that, say, the Australian Council of Social Services was really wanting to be focused on was an increase in the job seeker rate, because currently it's tracking at 25% below the poverty line. And although there was a 10% increase in rent assistance, there's many people who can't even afford to rent. So it's these people in that really vulnerable group that missed out. So by not increasing the job seeker rate, in many ways has left them more vulnerable in this difficult time as well, which is tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to be clear, in Australia, we kind of conflate unemployment benefits with dole bludgers. The statistics don't bear this out, but everyone knows someone they went to school with who's a bit lazy and was on unemployment benefits for a while. So we've kind of been trained to think of unemployment benefits as something that dole bludgers rely on. And it's terrible language. It's just in no way an accurate picture. Imagine you worked in a small manufacturing factory. Imagine you worked in a clothing warehouse. Imagine you worked in a travel agent, and for some reason that you went to work one day and it went broke. Imagine you just went to work and your job wasn't there, because businesses close all the time. Now, if you're lucky, when your employer goes broke, if you're lucky, you get paid. They don't owe you 2 or 4 weeks' wages. If you're lucky, then your superannuation payments are up to date. But if you're lucky, all you have is no income next week. But you still got to pay the rent, and you still got to buy some food. So in Australia, if you lose your job unexpectedly, unemployment's pretty low at the moment. You'll probably find another job. Most people do. There's a lot of turnover. Most people who are unemployed aren't long-term unemployed. But if you're on unemployment benefits for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, just waiting till you apply for another job and get it, you can be thousands of dollars in debt by the time you get that next job, because unemployment benefits in Australia are that stingy. They're that low. And we keep them that low because we're all terrified that we might pay some lazy person too much. But we're just blind to the fact that someone who lost their full-time job through no fault of their own and took a month or 6 weeks to get a new job, that person, thousands of dollars racked up on their credit card to get them through to that point. And we're going to have to fix it one day, but this government haven't tried at all.
Yeah, well, they're lucky if they have a credit card, aren't they? So I guess in response, what was in the opposition's budget response for cost of living? In particular, I know that there was a big piece on migration to try and reduce that pressure on housing, but was there much specifically for cost of living relief?
No, there wasn't. The reality is the opposition leader's speech, as is wont to do, it's not unusual in an opposition leader, but it's very much Peter Dutton's approach, was very critical of the government for not doing enough, but didn't actually spell out, any actual additional measures that would actually help with cost of living. He talked about nuclear energy, but pretty much every economist in the world would agree that nuclear is more expensive than the sources of energy we have in Australia right now. So it's not going to make it cheaper, it's going to make it dearer. He talked a lot about immigration, and he didn't talk about how lowering immigration was going to, make people's groceries cheaper or the school fees cheaper or anything else. And interestingly, he was very, very, very critical of the government for spending too much money. Right? He was very, well, on the one hand, you haven't done enough to help people with the cost of living crisis, but actually you're spending too much as it is. And when you look at why spending is growing in the budget, and it is, major parts of that are things like the age pension going up with inflation. Does anyone think we shouldn't be indexing the age pension to inflation? Or nearly $6 billion. Good story about this in the Herald yesterday or today, I think. $6 billion to fix a backlog that the coalition government created with veterans getting access to veterans' benefits. $6 billion, because it's hard to imagine, but literally thousands of our veterans were unable to get the benefits they were entitled to because the previous government had so massively underspent on the bureaucracy, on the public servants that deal with the veterans. So, you know, Peter Dutton's having a bob each way. He's saying the government needs to do more to help people, but he's criticising them for doing too much. And really, some of the problems the government fixing, like that $6 billion for veterans, I really think is a bit of a national tragedy. It's like robo debt for veterans.
Goodness. Oh, well, at least it was addressed in this budget, I guess, but that's why you're saying that there's an increase in spending. Well, not even a huge increase in spending. Apparently, it's still within the range that's normal and to be expected, maybe higher end of the range. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll have a chat now about housing. Housing is a major issue right now, and we keep hearing that there's a housing crisis. Rents are going up, and also mortgages have been going up because of the interest rate rises. I'll have a chat. Let's have a chat in a minute about, you know, the cuts. Both the opposition and the government were talking about cuts to migration. They were doing it a little bit differently, and let's have a chat about what that means, those different approaches. But first of all, I want to have a chat about specific measures to increase the housing supply in this country. I think there was a further $6 billion that was going to be handed out to the states to help build that infrastructure for new housing to be able to be developed. And that adds up to a total of $32 billion. Is this right? In the last 2 years that have been offered up for housing. And then the other thing is, we know that there's been a sort of a strangulation of the construction pipeline because there's not enough workforce, there's not enough construction workers. So the government also introducing another 20,000 fee-free TAFE courses to train the tradies. Do you think this will be enough to build those? So the government's thinking that they're aiming for 1.2 million new houses to be built in the next 5 years. Do you think this is enough?
No, I don't. And look, Australia, you know, no one ever really likes what economists say about housing, so apologies in advance. But look, it's much harder for politicians to talk about housing than it is for economists. But look, big picture, Australia has some of the most expensive housing in the world. Most countries don't approach housing the way we do. Most people don't talk about housing in the way we do. Most countries don't have stories about real estate on the front page of their newspapers every day for decades. So, you know, every country's a bit odd. Every country's got its foibles. One of our foibles is kind of how obsessed we are with housing. And our obsession with housing hasn't led to us having lots of it, and it certainly hasn't led to us having lots of cheap housing. But look, let me just start by saying pretty much everyone in Australia is of the view that investing in housing is a good long-run investment, right? I'm one of them, by the way. But if investing in housing is a good long-run investment, why don't governments do it? Like, you know, if I can borrow money and I can buy a house and I can expect the value of the house to go up, here's a tip. If the government did the same thing, then they wouldn't be in debt. Well, they would be in debt, like I am in debt with my house, right? This is not a problem for governments to be in debt because they built some housing, because the houses they bought, or more importantly, hopefully the houses they build, are going to provide essential services in the short term, housing, and go up in value over time. So we've kind of got this pretty backwards way of thinking about housing in Australia, that that the private sector, individuals, us, are very, very, very eager to go and borrow large amounts of money to build a house or buy a house, and we think that'll make us wealthier in the future. But governments, who, by the way, can borrow at cheaper interest rates than us, and have got better access to land than us, and have got better access to rezoning than anyone, if anyone could make a buck out of housing, you would think it's governments. But we've kind of told ourselves a couple of weird stories in Australia And I'm not saying we should all live in housing built by government, but I live in Canberra, apologies, and anyone who's lived in Canberra would know that Canberra is full of small red brick 3-bedroom cottages, which in Canberra are called gubbies, because here's a hint, the government built them, nearly all of them. Because, you know, when there were lots of public servants that had to move to Canberra when we made a capital, they had to have somewhere to live. So guess what? The government built all these red brick 3-bedroom cottages and then sold them to people. And Canberra's chock full of them, and people love them or hate them. But my point is not that everyone should live in what we think of as public housing, but governments are actually really good at just building lots of housing. And the best time for the government to build housing, by the way, is whenever we have a recession. The first industry that goes broke is the housing construction market. As soon as we have a recession, all the builders go broke. Guess what? That's the time the government should say, hey, I got a job for you. Come over here and we'll build some houses. And then when the economy picks up and all the builders want to go build houses for the private sector, you go, all right, off you go then. You go build them. This is not complicated stuff, but it kind of just doesn't fit in the ideology. It doesn't kind of fit in the rhetorical model we have. And then, sorry, long answer, but one last point. One of the reasons that we have a shortage of skilled workers in Australia in some parts of the country is that the skilled workers are in other parts of the country doing other things. And it's not polite to talk about this, but we've got state governments in Australia cancelling big infrastructure projects because they can't get skilled construction workers. We've got problems building houses because we can't get skilled construction workers. But the skilled construction workers didn't vanish. There's $50 billion worth of fossil fuel investment getting built in Western Australia right now. We're actually spending $50,000 million to build new gas and coal projects, which are enormous, but they require an enormous amount of builders, an enormous amount of welders, an enormous amount of machine operators, an enormous amount of concrete pourers. So it's kind of weird. We kind of talk about the shortage, but we don't talk about the fact that there's $50 billion worth of investments in the things that cause climate change taking place, while we've got state governments going, oh, I wish I could find someone to build a road. And we've got individuals saying, oh, I wish I could find someone to build me a house.
Interesting. And then I guess the other way that both the government and the opposition have felt that they needed to address the housing shortage was to reduce migration. And I think they've come at it slightly differently. And I'd like to ask you about the different approaches and how they will impact our economy as well. So we know that the Labor government has sought to reduce the temporary, focus more on the temporary migration by reducing students that come into the country, the number of overseas students, I should say, coming into the country. They've also made a sort of modest cut to the permanent migration figures as well by about 5,000. And then we have the opposition that's come in and focusing more on cuts to permanent migration as well. I wondered if you would have a comment on how those two different approaches aiming to do the same thing may have different impacts on our economy and also on our workforce as well, on the that supply chain for workforce.
Yeah, look, it's a really important question. It's a really hard question because it's so difficult to untangle the politics and the economics. And it's also so difficult to disentangle the short-term economic consequences of some of these things from their medium and their long-term consequences. So a lot of what we hear from pretty much everyone talking about these issues, a lot of what we hear is kind of partly right, but no one, including myself, can put their hand on their heart and say, I can tell you exactly how all of this is going to roll out. So what we wind up with is a government and an opposition really leaning hard on one particular fact, or leaning very hard on one particular kind of lever that they want to pull, the implication being that's the only fact that matters, or that's the only lever that exists. When in something as complicated as the interaction between a housing market that doesn't make a lot of sense to start with, immigration, which has short-run effects and long-run effects, and things like inflation that have different kind of causes and effects in the short run and the long run. I guess I'm just making a big case for how there's no right answer here. But now let me have a crack at interpreting some of what's going on. Both major parties are saying, look, maybe we need to slow migration down a bit. So let's start with what they agree on. They both think we need to slow migration down a bit. And there's probably good reason for that, not because migration is the problem and not because there's a right number of migrants to come in each year, but what happened after COVID, as with so many things, after COVID, the world kind of changed. It was a bit different. So having had the borders locked up, after COVID, we saw a lot of people coming in for multiple reasons. Students who had wanted to study for years during COVID had deferred their study. So guess what? They rushed in all at one time. Was that ideal? Probably not. Is it the biggest problem in Australia? Definitely not. But is it part of what's going on? You bet it is. Similarly, because, again, things had been shut down for a couple of years at the borders during COVID, there were skills shortages that have accumulated in some industries, particularly, for example, in health and aged care. So employers who hadn't been able to get their hands on those skilled workers for a couple of years, guess what? They wanted everybody to come the minute they could. Is that good? Yes, because we were solving a pre-existing skills problem. Is that bad because everyone came at once and they showed up at the same time as the students? Probably. So, again, while the politics is going to really look for what can we have the biggest fight about, actually they're both saying let's wind migration back a bit. They're using different arguments for why. That's politics. And they're focusing on slightly different parts of the migrant intake. Why? Because that's politics. They can't be seen to agree with each other too much. But the reality is they're both kind of trying to do something a bit similar. They're just describing it in a very different way. But just to conclude on this point, to kind of mess with people's heads a little bit, this real surge in house prices happened during COVID. Okay, so when we weren't letting any migrants in at all, when we were all locked up at home alone with no international travel, house prices really started to accelerate. So it's pretty hard to blame the migrants for the big increase in house prices when it happened at the first time in modern history where there were no migrants coming. Right. So I'm not saying there's no impact on, but then there's no link between migration and access to housing and access to services. Of course, in the short run, you can get problems there, but you also get problems when you've got skills shortages. And a lot of this is really just kind of catch up kind of stuff. So there are problems. Both parties are saying we should do something about it. But rather than saying, hey, look, we agree, we're heading in the right direction, politics being what it is, major party politics is let's find the small differences and exaggerate them rather than find the similarities and work constructively on them.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, the opposition is saying that they would like, or they would cut 45,000 from permanent migration. And I know that around 2/3 of permanent migrants, the skills based, the skills that we're short in, so that may mean that we get less teachers, less IT people, less engineers, that type of thing. Do you think that this will have an impact on the construction industry and on our need to get nurses and teachers and others into this country? Do you think it will end up as a skills shortage?
Yeah, look, again, a bit. There's truth in that. But there's 25 million people in Australia. Right, 25 million people. So 45,000 people over a couple of years. It's not a big number. Oh, Sophie, my iPad's about to go flat. I'll be back. I'm just going to go get my charger. So hold that thought. So
hold that thought.
I'm just going to reduce the population of this Zoom call. So just, I mean,
by 1/3.
We'll see if it helps house prices.
The other thing that I'd like to touch on when Richard comes back is There is this discussion that Australia would be in a recession right now if it wasn't for our immigration numbers keeping that, driving that growth in our economy. So I'll ask him about that as well and where we're headed, and does he think that we are actually heading for a recession as well? We've got some questions. Thank you. We've got 4 questions so far. Keep your questions coming in and we'll try and get to some as well. Hi.
Give me a second.
Good to see. This is what happens.
The excitement.
I'll check out where we're up to. So, Richard, you may still be able to hear me while you're working away in the background there.
Yes, I can.
I was wondering, maybe we come back to this question of recession. Do you think Australia would be in a recession right now if we didn't have this high level of migration over the last couple of years and the last year? Do you think that's what's kept us out of a recession at the moment? And what do you think the likelihood is that Australia might head towards a recession?
Right, I'm back.
So we're talking recession.
Yeah, I know, but I've had to swap my lights for my phone charger. So apologies if I...
You look great. You look great.
My hair still looks all right. Yeah. Well, so what an interesting question, because on the one hand, in Australia, we're worried that migrants could be causing inflation. But your question is, hang on, has migration kept us out of recession? And the answer is pretty much clearly yes, it has. So if you, and that's, again, doesn't mean we can't have a conversation about what the right level of migration is, but in Australia, we're bringing in 200, 300,000 people a year. We're looking at increasing our population every kind of 5 years by around 1 million people. Of course that's good for the retail sector. Of course that's good for the building sector. Of course that's good for anyone who sells things to customers. So, yeah, in Australia, but we do have, and have had for 30 years, quite high rates of migration compared to most developed countries. It was John Howard who really ramped up migration in Australia. And yes, that has all sorts of economic costs and benefits, but certainly most businesses focus on the benefit of bringing all those extra consumers in and bringing all those extra workers in. So, yes, I think it's safe to say that without migration in the last couple of years, the economy would have gone into recession. And that doesn't mean there aren't Australians that are really struggling at the moment, and unemployment started to rise a little bit. But, yeah, we've had nothing like the kind of recessions that we've had previously. And, yep, no doubt about it, migration played a positive role in helping keep us out of those.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions as well, so I'll try and sort of weave them into our conversation. But we're talking, we sort of moved on to small business or business here, and I thought maybe let's address what was in the budget for small business, or maybe in either budget, what was in the government's budget and what was in the opposition's budget for small business.
Look, a little bit. I mean, basically, for those who, to be clear, small business is a really big employer in Mackellar. If you watch the news, if you listen to politicians, you'd think nearly every Australian works in a coal mine, works in a gas well, or maybe works in a factory. If you think about how any politician, maybe not you, Sophie, but certainly a major party politician, if they want to show themselves as a real person that understands real workers, it's always high-vis and hard hats. And, a very small percentage of the Australian population wears high-vis or hard hats. A very small percentage of the population, certainly less than 10%. So the way we're kind of trained to think about what a job is, it's often a bloke. It's a bloke doing something with their hands. But, of course, the biggest employer in Mackellar is the health sector. Health and aged care are by far the biggest employers. And then you've got scientific and technical and production workers in Mackellar, really big employers. The retail sector, really big employers. Across Australia, literally 0.5% of Australians work in coal and gas. In Mackellar, it's even lower than that. Much lower than that. And small business is almost invisible in the way the media talks about jobs. But small business probably employs around 30% of people in Mackellar, around 30%. Possibly more. The data's not as good as you might think. But so small business is a really big part of the economy. We keep calling it small business, but the fossil fuel industry is small and small business is big. But our words get in the way here. So look, in the budget there were some extensions of accelerated depreciation, which is really it's a sort of a tax concession for small businesses. It particularly helps them, for example, if they're buying new capital equipment. But most small businesses don't actually have lots of capital equipment. That's why they're small businesses. It's hard for a small business to build a giant factory. One of those big bits of capital equipment that they do buy is their cars. Tax treatment of cars in Australia is quite concessional, and the extensions to the accelerated depreciation will help some small businesses there. Both major parties support that, so that'll happen. The energy credit that we're talking about before, the rebate, the $300, that goes to small businesses as well. So some small business owners will get 2 of those. There were some things in there for small business, but again, it's big business that gets our attention, even though small business employs far more people. So the ASX 200, the biggest 200 companies listed on the stock exchange, between them employ far less people than small business. But again, you think about the media, you think about what you see on the news, it's big minds and big business. They have big PR budgets, I suppose.
Yeah. Let's move on to the Future Made in Australia, because that was also a really big part of the government's budget. I think, addressing that cost of living, but also this kind of visionary move into the Future Made in Australia. Do you think that it will actually allow us to become a renewable energy superpower? Will Australia be able to take on that position with what the government has or will invest in the future? Because of a lot of it is production tax credits. In the future when production happens, credits will happen at that stage. But will it be setting up our economy so that we are able to manufacture, we are able to value add here in this country, and we are, competitive when it comes to these new green energy or manufacturing in Australia? And what will it mean for Australia as well if we are able to do that?
Yeah, look, good question. And I mean, the short answer is that there's some good stuff going on behind these announcements, but there's not enough detail, or I'd say enough money, to really kind of assume we're going to see a big difference here. Now, again, in Australia, we talk about mining all the time. We talk about fossil fuels all the time. The manufacturing industry in Australia today employs around 800,000 people. The coal and gas industry employs around 50,000 people. So about 16 times as many people work in manufacturing today. And most Australians probably think we don't have a manufacturing industry. Our manufacturing industry isn't as big as it used to be. Our manufacturing industry isn't as big as the average European country, Germany, Italy, France. These high-income, high-wage, high-tax countries have very big manufacturing industries compared to Australia. We've let ours dwindle because, we're just always obsessed with talking about mining and agriculture. So it's good that the government's saying, what, we can and we should make some more stuff here. No problem with that. But the announcements we've seen so far, there's been an announcement around spending some money to encourage solar panel production up in the Hunter Valley. Yeah, fine, good. I grew up in the Hunter Valley. It's a nice part of the world. It's hopefully going to get out of coal pretty quickly. and building some solar panels up there won't be the worst idea in the world. But to be clear, it's not big. It's not going to transform the hunter economy. It's not going to transform the Australian economy. The big stuff in the budget is these tax credits you referred to, these production and tax credits for things like hydrogen, which sound good, but as you said, the money only kind of gets spent. The government contribution only occurs if, and it's a big if the private sector comes and starts doing big investment in things like green iron and steel. So to give you an example, imagine I announced in the budget, I'm going to create a new tax credit for anyone who can invent hover cars. And if you can invent hover cars, then I'll give you a big tax credit, right? I'll halve your tax rate, and all the profits that you make from selling your hover cars will only pay half the amount of tax that the people doing everything else have to pay. And then I budget and I say, my tax credit for your future hover car industry is going to cost me $10 billion. But if you don't invent hover cars, it's not going to cost me a cent. So, my fear here is that, we elect governments for 3-year terms. This government is saying, hey, in 7 or 10 years' time, good things are going to happen. And when the good things happen, we won't charge people as much tax on the profits from their good things. So look how we're going to encourage all this investment. And, it's not bad. It's not bad what they're proposing, and tax credits are a good way to encourage businesses to do certain things, but there's no certainty that it's going to happen. And, if you're serious about tackling climate change, as I am, you got to do things in the here and now. You got to do more good things today. You got to stop doing bad things today. Announcing a tax credit that might kick in 5 or 7 years' time, yeah, fine, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it, but we're still spending, $14 billion a year subsidising fossil fuels, and we're doing that right now. So the tax credits for hydrogen in the future, maybe, but we're spending a fortune subsidising fossil fuels today. And, I'd rather support small business today by, phasing out the fossil fuel industry faster. Seems a bit weird to subsidise the fossil fuel industry and, not do more to help small business.
Seems a bit weird to me as well. The other thing I was looking at is the opposition when we're thinking about these hopefully investment in this becoming a renewable energy superpower, investing in green metals and critical minerals and that type of thing. The opposition, or Peter Dutton, was saying that these industries should stand on their own. They shouldn't be propped up by government subsidies or tax concessions or things like that. But we see what's happening in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, and that has attracted a whole lot of private capital, trillion. How much? You tell me, Richard. How much? So over $1 trillion in private capital into the US. Do you think, I guess you're saying this is a bit of an if and a maybe, because the large proportion of what the government announced was these production tax credits that may occur in the future. Do you think that it will have the desired impact of actually attracting capital to Australia?
Oh, look, I think it could, but that's the problem. I only think it could. And if we're serious, and it's a big if again, but if we're serious, we wouldn't want to be saying could, we'd be saying will. We'd be saying must. We'd be saying certainly. So the fact that these tax credits might work isn't a damning critique of them, but it's not a ringing endorsement. So again, if we want to, so this government wanted to help a gas project get up in Middle Arm in Darwin. So it gave it $1.5 billion of our money, cash up front. It didn't say, I'll give you a tax credit in 7 years' time. It said, I really want you to build this gas project in Darwin. Would a $1.5 billion of other people's money help? Yes, it would. All right, here you go. Have $1.5 billion. Good for you. We don't ever get the billion back, the $1.5 billion back. We gave it away as a gift. So, the problem isn't the tax credits. The question is that going to be enough? Is that going to be enough to attract the investment that we want? And is it going to be enough to attract it as fast as we want? Now, Peter Dutton's been quite cute on all of this, because one of the biggest costs of the budget is we have a tax credit for diesel. And the biggest user of diesel in Australia is the mining industry. So you got Peter Dutton saying, oh, I don't like the idea of tax credits for hydrogen. Oh, no, I'm not a tax credit kind of guy. I'm a stand on your own 2 feet kind of guy. What about diesel for the mining industry, Pete? Oh, that's a different issue. Like, come off it. So, you know, in Australia, you know, Scott Morrison was happy to subsidise car parks in marginal electorates. You know, we spent $30 billion on the inland railway line that Barnaby Joyce wanted. It's so inland, it's not even going to make it to the coast. It's going to stop in Ipswich. It won't even make it to Brisbane Port. So, you know, Peter Dutton didn't mind subsidising the inland rail, and Peter Dutton didn't mind subsidising car parks. But apparently he doesn't think that, you know, tax breaks for people investing, and he doesn't mind tax breaks for people investing in housing, back to what we were talking about before. But when it comes to encouraging new investment in a brand new technology, big investments required to do things like make green iron at scale, he's like, oh no, I'm no interventionist. I like to keep the public's money, you know, in the public's pocket, not in the private sector's pocket. As if, you know, they were throwing our money at everything they could think of in the lead up to the 2022 election, as you well know.
That's true. And I guess the other thing that the opposition has been talking about a lot is how we manage this global energy transition that we're going through, and they've come up with nuclear power, nuclear energy is one of the strategies that we may be able to move forward on this. But in the budget, there wasn't a whole lot on nuclear. We sort of heard that there would be a costing and all that type of thing before the budget, yet we haven't heard about the costing for nuclear so far. There wasn't really anything in the budget. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, look, the coalition were in power for 10 years. How many nuclear power stations did they build? None. How many did they propose? None. Did they have an inquiry into it? Yes. What did it say? Said they're not a very good idea. Right? And then after 10 years in government, they're like, you know what we should do? We should really hurry up and build nuclear power stations. Now, you know, I've been to plenty of countries with nuclear power stations. You know, I've spent a lot of time in France. It's a really nice country. They get most of their power from nuclear. And you know what? If I was living in France, the last thing I'd do is say, hey, you should shut that nuclear power station down tomorrow. That's a crazy idea. Like, if you've already got a nuclear power station running, please keep it running. Don't start burning coal or gas.
They cost a lot to build, don't they?
Well, that's right. but once they're built, you know, you might as well run them. Yeah. Whereas what Peter Dutton's doing is sort of saying, look at all these other countries that built nuclear reactors in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, and they've learned how to build them and they know how to maintain them. They've got a workforce for them. Right? Look at them, they can do it. Why can't we? Well, you know what, we probably could, but was Peter Dutton in a hurry to do it when he was in government? No. Why not? Because it's expensive and it's slow. And of all the things, starting with a white sheet of paper, we don't have a nuclear industry in Australia of any scale. We've got the small Lucas Heiss reactor down south. That's it. So, you know, everything about the climate science says that we need to really crack on at pace. And the problem we've got, I said it before, but, you know, I think it's worth repeating. We're spending $14 billion a year to subsidise fossil fuels, $14 billion a year to subsidise fossil fuels, and we've got the coalition saying maybe one day we'll get around to building nuclear. Well, even if we could, the science says we need to act faster than that. And Labor's saying, oh, we're going to build lots of new gas, but don't worry, we're going to invent carbon capture and storage, and we're going to invent how to store it underground safely, and we know it's going to be cheap. So they're both selling magic puddings. They're both selling fantasy kind of you know, hope in a jar solutions, while actually supporting subsidies for the underlying cause of the problem in the here and now. So we can't turn off all the coal tomorrow. No one's suggesting we should. We can't turn off all the gas tomorrow. No one's suggesting we should. But what the science and the engineering and the economics say is just crack on and do the stuff that we know how to do it faster, roll out storage, get better at energy efficiency. There's a whole bunch of things we can do, and people are right. Yes, you can't do it all tomorrow. I know, everyone knows. But if you can't do it all tomorrow, you know what you can't do tomorrow? Build a nuclear power station. That's 10, probably 20 years away minimum. And the science says that's just too long to wait.
And somebody's asked me on the chat, what's your position on nuclear power? And I guess it's exactly that, is that if we want to make a difference on climate change, then we really need to be acting now in this decade. You've got the Climate Council saying we need to really make an impact here before 2030. And we're already 40% of the way down the track of renewable energy feeding into our energy supply. So for me, nuclear power is very expensive, and it will happen too late. And I think those small modular nuclear, there's only 2 pilot studies currently up and running in the world. There's nothing that's available to buy right now off the shelf. That technology does not exist to buy and start, constructing here in Australia. It's too late. And we are very lucky here in Australia, aren't we, with the sun and the wind that we have here. A lot of people say, oh, well, when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, we'll run into problem. And there are ways of firming for that with the hydro and with the batteries and things. But also this interconnected grid. Australia is a very large country, and when it's not shining, the sun's not shining somewhere, it'll be shining somewhere else, or it'll be, we have a lot of wind as well. So I think for Australia, and you're right, it comes down to the individual country, what suits the individual country. We're very lucky here in Australia that we have these renewable energy resources. Some countries like Japan, I know that deep offshore wind turbines, they're not yet in existence. Their quality of sunlight's not the same that we have here. They have earthquakes, so it makes it difficult with the nuclear, although they have their nuclear. But each country has their own options, don't they? And I think for Australia, renewable energy, we're already a long way down the track of it anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And again, when the coalition were in power, when their decisions mattered, it was John Howard who invented the renewable energy target, like back in 2000 or 2001, I remember it. So this is not new. This problem's been coming for decades. And unfortunately, these kind of false solutions keep getting thrown at us, when we kind of get up any momentum for doing the simple things. But, storage in all sorts of forms is becoming increasingly affordable. The more we invest in our transmission grid, the easier it is to move the electrons around to where they're needed. And look, all the new technologies coming on board, including things like offshore wind, including floating offshore wind. If people think nuclear is viable, well, I tell you what, those technologies are a lot closer in time and a lot lower in cost than the small modular reactors that. Again, they're just false hope. They're expensive, they're slow, and they're an excuse for inaction, I fear.
So let's move on to health. We haven't really got very long, so I might just touch a little bit on health. What was in the budget for health? I mean, personally, as a GP, I know that there's a massive shortage of GPs. That doesn't seem to have been addressed. There wasn't any increase in the Medicare rebates this time around, so you're not going to find it cheaper to go to a GP. There's lessons. There's still a low proportion of GPs who are still able to bulk bill the majority of their patients. So there was little investment in health. The other thing that I've been looking a lot at is prevention, and the National Obesity Strategy and the National Preventative Health Strategy. Neither of those have been funded either. And it just seems to not make sense to me that we're not sort of turning off the tap when it comes to creating this abundance of chronic disease that are really expensive and really complex to treat at the end. We should be turning off the tap at the start. Have you got any sort of thoughts on the health, on these budgets, both the response and the budget on health?
Yeah, look, I think you've got better ideas than me on how best to help the health system, and that's why I think it's important that we have, diverse people in the House of Reps, including actual doctors like yourself. But as an economist, the way I look at it is, whether, to come back to climate change, prevention is better than cure. When it comes to defence, prevention is better than cure. But, when it comes to health, we're like, oh, prevention's a bit expensive. Let's just focus on cure. That's not economics.
Exactly right.
Well, it's not economics. I don't think it's very good health policy. I don't even understand the politics of it. Like, I would have thought sort of preventative health is good politics. But I think that the real explanation is it takes time for investments in preventative health to become visible. And it doesn't take time to do things that kind of people can see right now. So hospital, ambulance ramping was a huge issue in South Australian state election a couple of years ago. The visibility of the ambulances parked out the front of the hospital is proof of failure. Now, of course we should do something about that. But because we do something about that doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about prevention at the same time. And again, we know, we're willing to spend $300 billion on a couple of nuclear submarines just in case. Just in case. And every time you land, every time you come into land in an Australian airport, look around if you're in a window seat, you will see a fire brigade sitting at the airport with trained firefighters sitting in multi-million-dollar firefighting trucks, just in case your plane burst into flames. And you know what? Luckily, our planes very rarely burst into flames, but we know that we want to be prepared, right? So we have all of these resources pre-deployed, ready to go, just in case the plane crashes. Imagine if we had that approach in our hospital system. Imagine if we had that approach in a GP clinic. We've just been trained to slice it so close to the bone that we're terrified a doctor might stand around for 2 minutes with nothing to do. So we've kind of gone to the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So no, prevention is good health, but it's also good economics. But the politics of crisis management dominate the policy benefits of genuine prevention. And yeah, I think we need to raise the public's expectations of what we could do.
Well, I 100% agree. I think prevention makes such good economic sense. It seems crazy to me that we're investing in the other end, right at the end of the equation. We've only really got a few minutes left, so I thought this might be a good question to finish up on. And it is, and I guess we can talk in terms of the budget, but how can we improve intergenerational fairness? There was a little bit in the budget, yeah. How can we do that? I mean, there was a couple of things in the budget, but nothing that's going to turn this growing intergenerational inequality. There's nothing in there that was going to turn that around. We saw a bit of tinkering with the HECS to make it slightly fairer, but not much else really. And particularly housing is a major issue for young people, that accessibility to buying a home or having a home or renting a home. What do you think we can do to improve intergenerational fairness?
I think it's a much bigger problem than perhaps people realise. If you think about what a lot of young people are experiencing in Australia today, they're experiencing really, really expensive access to housing. They're experiencing really low wage growth. Their wages have probably gone backwards in the last couple of years. They're rightly really concerned about climate change. They're living in increasingly congested cities, very poor access to public transport in large parts of the city. We've really loaded up a lot of pain on young people. And in turn, opinion polls and behaviour at ballot boxes around the world are showing that young people are really starting to either get quite angry or just checking out. And both of those are very dangerous. So I'm going to guess that the average age of people watching tonight is way over 18. And I think what's really important is for older Australians, including old people like myself, but whatever we're at, wherever we're at in our life, I think when we think about policy, when we think about the budget, we think about the economy, when we think about elections, I really think we better start thinking not just about what the newspapers train us to do and say, what's in it for me? Because if we don't start thinking about what's in it for other people, if we don't start thinking about what's in it for young people, if we don't start thinking, do I want my kids to be able to afford to live within 100 kilometres of me? Do I want my kids to have $100,000 debt when they finish their degree? Do I want the teachers and the nurses that look after my kids or my grandkids to commute in from 80 kilometres away? Or do I actually kind of want to live in a community? If we don't start thinking about these things, we really are going to cause all the kind of social problems that, historically haven't really been evident in Australia. So I think, sorry to end on a downer note there, but yeah, young people are really taking it in the neck in Australia today. And we can kind of think of that as a young person's problem. But I got 2 kids. I'm not voting thinking about me. I'm voting thinking about them because I'm doing all right, So somehow we need to reset our public conversation and not be told that this is a young person issue and this is a middle-aged person issue and this is an old person issue. I think we need to start thinking about what kind of country we want to have, because we are one of the richest countries in the world and we are living at the richest point in world history. But young people today are really struggling. And when I say young people, I mean young women with kids. Childcare is really expensive. Access to health is really expensive. University is really expensive. Wages are really low for young people. So, I think we've got to think a lot harder about not just how to help young people, but how to actually build a community and build a country that young people are going to, enjoy growing up in, because the consequences of getting that wrong are not just consequences borne by young people. It's the society we're going to get old in. And I don't want angry people looking after me when I'm old, thanks.
Exactly. No, there are big structural issues that need to be faced, and one of them in particular is the housing crisis and the inability of young people, how much harder it is for young people to get into the housing market or just to have shelter over their heads. And I guess one last thing is in Australia, we have a very low petroleum resource rent tax when we compare that to what's happening in other countries like Norway, who have a massive sovereign wealth fund that sets up their, future generations and pays for things, the services that we are sort of struggling, it seems, in the budget to find money for, finding enough money for health, finding enough money for education, for aged care, for defence, all those really important things for the NDIS. We did see in the last budget there was a very modest, small increase to the petroleum resource rent tax, but very, very modest compared to what's happening in Norway. What do we need to do on the petroleum resource rent tax?
Well, let me just start with a couple of simple observations. In Saudi Arabia, when the price of oil goes up, they all get happy, right? Because they're one of the world's largest exporters, the largest exporter of oil. So when the price of the oil they export goes up, Saudis are happy. Australia is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the big bubble boats, right? We export more LNG than anyone else in the world. But when the price of gas goes up, we're sad. How broken is that? How broken is it that we're the largest exporter of LNG in the world, we're the largest exporter of thermal coal in the world, we're the second largest exporter largest exporter of metallurgical coal, second largest exporter of thermal coal. We're a fossil fuel superpower. We're the third biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world. Saudi Arabia 1, Russia 2, Australia 3. Yay us, third biggest in the world. But when the price of energy goes up, we all feel poor. And it's because the fossil fuel industry is overwhelmingly 85% foreign owned, and it pays almost no tax here. So, in Norway, they tax their fossil fuel industry and they give their kids free university. In Australia, we subsidise our fossil fuel industry and charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. This is wild. The Australian government collects more revenue from HECS than it does from our petroleum resource rent tax. So, government choices really matter here, and the Saudis tax their oil and gas industry very heavily. and they have low income taxes, and, you know, some of the richest people in the world, the Norwegians tax their oil and gas industry. And guess what? They still have an oil and gas industry. It didn't vanish. Right? The companies are still there. It's just they leave a lot of money behind in Norway. Yet here we are in Australia, third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world, and we collect a trivial amount of tax. And I know the fossil fuel industry is good at saying, oh, we pay billions. Well, I hate to tell you, the Australian economy last year is about $3 trillion, $3,000 billion. So paying a couple of $1 billion in tax isn't a lot. Nurses, let me just choose my words carefully here my words carefully here. Nurses pay more tax than the gas industry in Australia. Nurses do. Right? But nurses don't take out full-page ads saying, hey, we're the backbone of the economy. More money from HECS than from the petroleum resource rent tax. But do the students take out full-page ads saying, hey, we're the backbone of the economy? We're getting conned. We're getting conned.
Well, I think on that note, I'll thank you very much, Richard. We do have a lot to think about, don't we? There are ways to address these issues, like you said, is happening in other countries, but we need to have the will to do it here in Australia too, and it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for coming along tonight and chatting to us and giving us your insights on the budget, and we look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Richard. We'll see you later.